This audiobook was narrated by Victor Pauter. You can find me on youtube.com/Victor Pauter, where I make videos for aspiring manga and comic book artists. And now, Drawabox Lesson 1: Lines, Ellipses, and Boxes. Understanding Drawing. If you haven't yet read through Lesson 0, you absolutely should before moving forward. It covers important information on how these lessons are meant to be used and highlights common pitfalls many students encounter that can hinder their progress as they move forwards. The major skill sets. In my experience, there are two major sets of skills involved in drawing, and they both play important roles throughout, but it's important to understand the role they play in drawing as a whole and how we go about developing in each area. Mechanical skills, analytical skills. The mechanical skills. These are composed of everything we require to command our muscles to make specific movements, resulting in particular marks on a page or canvas. When we start out, we tend to try and control everything our hand does with our conscious brain, because we want to be absolutely precise and accurate. This approach has a few problems, however. This desire to be hyper-accurate results in numerous course corrections, each occurring whenever our brain notices that we've gone off track. This may result in a line that keeps roughly to the path we've intended, but it also makes for a pretty wobbly, stiff, and erratic line. If we're focusing so much on a task as simple as drawing a line, then our brains are not free to deal with all the other problems involved. Focus is a limited resource, and we can only think about so much before we start spreading ourselves too thin. These mechanical skills are pretty similar to the major motor skills we employ in our daily lives: walking, talking, manipulating objects, even breathing. We don't have to consciously think about these things. At the very most, we might consciously decide to walk somewhere or to grab an object, but we don't have to worry about all the specifics involved beyond that. This is because a different part of the brain, the cerebellum, handles these tasks. It is often referred to as muscle memory. Ultimately, the processes involved in markmaking can be offloaded onto the cerebellum, though it takes practice. That's what the exercises in this lesson will explore. The analytical skills. These consist of the skills required to truly see and understand the world around you. Humans have evolved a natural instinct to simplify what we see and really strip it down to the basics needed to survive. When running from predators or hunting prey, we learned as a species to throw away all but the most critical of information. While this has helped us thrive, it's also made us pretty ineffective when it comes to drawing what we actually see, especially when it comes to doing so from memory. The result is what is generally referred to as symbol drawing, like the tendency to draw a house as a square with a triangle for a roof, and it is one of the many things we must unlearn. We do this by getting used to drawing exactly what we see while we see it, continually looking back to our source material, only looking away long enough to make one or two very specific marks. Over time, this will rewire our brains and make our memory more effective for this task. But for the time being, don't trust in your memory. It will simplify things without you noticing and cannot be relied upon. More than simply drawing what we see, analytical skills speak to truly understanding what is in front of us. This is a topic we'll delve into a little later, but one of the core aspects of Drawabox is to learn how everything around us can be broken down into very simple primitive components. Understanding which forms serve as the foundation for a given object, and how these forms are connected to each other in space, gives us all the information we need to go on and reconstruct it on a page. Lines. Markmaking. The fundamentals of markmaking. Drawing is, at its simplest level, the act of putting marks on a page in order to communicate or convey something. Therefore, at its very core, the most basic concept we must learn is how to go about making a mark. There are many different marks you'll find yourself needing to draw, but at their very core, they follow one central rule. Marks must flow continuously, smoothly, and maintain a consistent trajectory. This tells us a couple of things. First off, if a line must stretch all the way from one side of the page to the other, it must be made up of a single continuous stroke. Secondly, a line should not wobble back and forth with an unsteady hand. Thirdly, if you're drawing some kind of detail that zigzags back and forth, following distinctly different directions, like a tuft of grass or fur, wherever the trajectory changes, the stroke should end and a fresh one should begin. This may seem contradictory or unclear, so I'll provide some examples. Flowing continuously. In this image, you'll see two lines, A and B. A shows a pretty common mistake a lot of beginners make, usually referred to as chicken scratch. It involves drawing a number of very small strokes and building up the whole line from the first point to the second. The problem with this is that the resulting line looks very ragged. No form drawn with lines like these will feel solid and sturdy, so they're not particularly useful. Line B shows this done more correctly. It's a single continuous stroke stretching from point to point. It's smooth and consistent, and while it arcs slightly and isn't perfect, it is workable. Flowing smoothly. What you see in line A is the result of a student having their priorities mixed up, and it's a pretty normal occurrence. It shows that the student is focusing mostly on the accuracy of the stroke, and in order to continually follow the path they've set out for themselves, they sacrifice the flow of the line. Between these two, accuracy and flow, it is in fact flow that must be put first. When you execute your mark, you need to draw with a confident, persistent pace, enough to keep your brain from interfering and attempting to course correct as you go. This is such a critical point that I drew this silly comic to illustrate the point. Now, this will make your lines less accurate, but this is something that will improve with practice, and the ghosting method introduced later in this lesson will help a great deal as well. Maintaining a consistent trajectory. This one relates to the previous point, avoiding wobbles, as a wobbly line does not maintain a single consistent trajectory, but it can also be applied when deciding how many individual marks one requires. The problem set out here is an advanced one that won't come into play until at least lesson 3, but it's still worth discussing. When tackling something like this, beginners will often attempt to draw a single continuous stroke to capture all the tufts and shapes that arise when drawing fur or grass or anything of that nature that features seemingly repeated elements, though frequently they have a lot of unique individual features between them. The problem here is that it causes the student to go into autopilot. They stop considering the design of each of those tufts, and the continuous stroke is liable to round out corners that should be pointed. All in all, it makes the result very muddy and indistinct. In general, remember that if you're zigzagging mindlessly, unless there's a clearly repeating rhythm that you're following, you're probably doing something wrong. The correct approach, as depicted in B, is to separate the marks out by trajectory. As soon as a trajectory changes, usually at some kind of hard corner, the mark should end and a new one should start. This keeps us consciously aware of what we're drawing, of the nature and purpose of each stroke, and allows us to continue to design the result. Lines. Using your arm. Your most important drawing tool. When you're actually sitting down to draw, it's important to understand the tools you're using. I don't mean your pens, pencils, or paper, I mean your arm. In terms of drawing, we can move our arm using any one of 3 major points as a pivot. The pivots of the arm. The pivots are as follows: wrist, elbow, shoulder. Moving from the wrist affords us a very small arc of motion. This is very good for creating stiff, accurate line work, but falls apart when you have to create strokes that flow smoothly and consistently. It's often the reason you see students chicken scratching early on, because they're trying to draw everything from their wrists. It's not surprising since we've spent most of our lives writing, which we do from the wrist. The shoulder gives us a much larger arc of motion and makes it easier to draw consistent flowing lines. The downside is that beginners are generally not even remotely comfortable with that kind of a motion. It's unfamiliar and usually relies on muscles that are underdeveloped, so it'll feel awkward and quickly grows tired or sore at first. What do you mean I can't draw from the wrist? I'm not saying we never draw from the wrist. As mentioned above, there are things the wrist excels at, specifically drawing stiff but precise marks, which may come up frequently in very tight areas of detail or texture. As explained in the next section, however, we are primarily going to be drawing from the shoulder, especially through these first few lessons, because those exercises demand lines that flow smoothly and consistently. Furthermore, the majority of people are already far more capable of drawing with their wrists than they are with their shoulders. Always remember that the exercises and lessons we're doing here are intended to build out your skill set. To put it simply, these lessons aim to teach you what you need to know in the long run, not what will necessarily be the easiest right now. Generally speaking, we try to avoid the path of least resistance and focus instead on what is of greatest overall value. The path of least resistance. The very fact that drawing from the shoulder is considerably more difficult is exactly why I want you to use your shoulder pivot as much as possible. There are plenty of cases where the elbow will work just fine, and it will absolutely be much easier for you. But the biggest trap in drawing is getting in the habit of taking the path of least resistance. It's a tendency many beginners have. When faced with two options, they will lean one way or the other because it's the easier option, not because it's the best suited to solve the problem they're facing. It's a mindset that must be broken, and it's something we'll come across time and time again. With markmaking being so critical, I want you to apply the shoulder pivot wherever you can, so you can grow accustomed to it and comfortable with it. It will be tiresome and you'll be forced to take more breaks. It will make you sore as you develop muscles that until now have gone ignored. But it will also make it so when you are faced with the decision of which pivot to use for a given mark, you will make that decision entirely on what the best option is rather than what suits you best. What is drawing from the shoulder? Drawing from the shoulder means driving the motion from the muscles that control that joint. Being a ball joint rather than a hinge joint like the elbow, the shoulder has a pretty considerable range of motion. This means that even though the surface you're drawing on is flat and the motion from a pivot is an arc, you should be able to move your arm from that pivot and still have your pen touch the page at all times with minimal adjustment from your elbow. Now, note that I'm saying minimal. I really don't like mentioning this because it's very easy for students to overdo it. But your elbow may move slightly to compensate and maintain the pen's contact with the page. This does not mean you should be drawing in a way that involves a lot of motion from multiple pivot points, as this will make the motion muddy and indistinct, and will likely cause you to depend far too much on your elbow, rather than properly developing familiarity with your shoulder. All I'm saying is, don't worry or fuss over it if there is a little bit of movement at the elbow. Just be sure that the drawing motion as a whole is being driven by your shoulder muscles. One exercise I frequently recommend to get familiar with the different pivots is to pivot from your wrist a little, to get used to what that feels like, then lock it. Locking your joint means that you're going to make a conscious effort not to engage the muscles that allow you to pivot from that joint. Next, do the same with your elbow. Pivot from that joint, then lock it as well. Finally, do it for your shoulder. This exercise helps, especially whenever you catch yourself having fallen back to drawing from your elbow or wrist, which will happen often, because it reminds you of what each joint's motions feel like. One thing that can help you is to draw on an angled surface, similar to a drafting desk. You don't need to go out and spend hundreds of dollars on a desk though. You can probably achieve a similar result with some books propping up a drawing board. None of this is necessary, however, but do be sure to sit with good posture and draw at a clean, uncluttered desk or table. More than anything, all of this is meant to familiarize yourself with how your arm works, so eventually you will have a much greater degree of control over every aspect of it. Lines. Homework. A reminder. Before we get into your homework exercises, I want to make a few things very clear. Do not grind. Complete the recommended amount of each exercise to the best of your ability and move on. Do not rush. Give yourself the time you need to plan your lines out, to prepare appropriately, and to demonstrate your current best. Read all the instructions carefully, multiple times if necessary. While I've tried to organize this content in as digestible a manner as I can, there is a lot of information here, and there is no way you'd absorb all of it at once. Take breaks. One day, you're going to be a beast who can draw for hours without breaking a sweat. But right now, you need to be patient with yourself and take it all one step at a time. Homework and exercises. Every Drawabox lesson consists of lecture content and exercises that are assigned as homework. It's best to complete this homework before moving on to the next section. As this lesson consists of 3 sections, lines, ellipses, and boxes, it is best that you only submit your work for review when you've completed all 3 sections, rather than the exercises of just one section at a time. The homework assignment for this section is as follows. 2 filled pages of the superimposed lines exercise. 1 filled page of the ghosted lines exercise. 2 filled pages of the ghosted planes exercise. All the assigned work for this section should be done in ink, using fine liners / felt tip pens as described here. In a pinch, I will accept work done in ballpoint, but only if the situation is dire. This is an exception only for this lesson as students get started.